Chapter 15. The Virtues, the Unity of a Human Life, and the Concept of a Tradition. Any contemporary attempt to envisage each human life as a whole, as a unity, whose character provides the virtues with an adequate telos, encounters two different kinds of obstacle, one social and one philosophical. The social obstacles derive from the way in which modernity partitions each human life into a variety of segments, each with its own norms and modes of behavior. So work is divided from leisure, private life from public, the corporate from the personal. So both childhood and old age have been wrenched away from the rest of human life and made over into distinct realms. And all these separations have been achieved so that it is the distinctiveness of each and not the unity of the life of the individual who passes through these parts in terms of which we are taught to think and feel. The philosophical obstacles derive from two distinct tendencies, one chiefly, though not only, domesticated in analytical philosophy and one at home in both sociological theory and in existentialism. The former is the tendency to think atomistically about human life and to analyze complex actions and transactions in terms of simple components. Hence, the recurrence in more than one context of the notion of a basic action. That particular actions derive their character as parts of larger wholes is a point of view alien to our dominant ways of thinking, and yet one which is necessary at least to consider if we are to begin to understand how a life may be made more than a sequence of individual actions and episodes. Equally, the unity of a human life becomes invisible to us when a sharp separation is made either between the individual and the roles that he or she plays, a separation characteristic not only of Sartre's existentialism, but also of the sociological theory of Ralph Dahrendorf, or between the different role and quasi-role enactments of an individual life, so that life come to appear as nothing but a series of unconnected episodes, a liquidation of the self-characteristic, as I noted earlier, of Goffman's sociological theory. I already suggested in Chapter 3 that both the Sartrean and Goffmanesque conceptions of selfhood are highly characteristic of the modes of thought and practice of modernity. It is perhaps therefore unsurprising to realize that the self, as thus conceived, cannot be envisaged as a bearer of the Aristotelian virtues. For a self separated from its roles in the Sartrean mode loses that arena of social relationships in which the Aristotelian virtues function, if they function at all. The patterns of a virtuous life would fall under those commendations of conventionality which Sartre put into the mouth of Antonin Rotunin in La Nausée, and which he uttered in his own person in L'Être et le Néant. Indeed, the self-refusal of the inauthenticity of conventionalized social relationships becomes what integrity is diminished into in Sartre's account. At the same time, the liquidation of the self into a set of demarcated areas of role-playing allows no scope for the exercise of dispositions which could genuinely be accounted virtues in any sense remotely Aristotelian. For a virtue is not a disposition which makes for success only in some one particular type of situation. What are spoken of as the virtues of a good committee man, or of a good administrator, or of a gambler, or a pool hustler, are professional skills professionally deployed in those situations where they can be effective, not virtues. Someone who genuinely possesses a virtue can be expected to manifest it in very different types of situation, many of them situations where the practice of a virtue cannot be expected to be effective in the way that we expect a professional skill to be. Hector exhibited one and the same courage in his parting from Andromache and on the battlefield with Achilles. Eleanor Marx exhibited one in the same compassion in her relationship with her father, in her work with trade unionists, and in her entanglement with Aveling. And the unity of a virtue in someone's life is intelligible only as a characteristic of a unitary life, a life that can be conceived and evaluated as a whole. Hence, just as in the discussion of the changes in and fragmentation of morality which accompanied the rise of modernity in the earlier parts of this book, each stage in the emergence of the characteristically modern views of the moral judgment was accompanied by a corresponding stage in the emergence of the characteristically modern conceptions of selfhood. So now, in defining the particular pre-modern concept of the virtues with which I have been preoccupied, it has become necessary to say something of the concomitant concept of selfhood, a concept of self whose unity resides in the unity of a narrative which links birth to death as narrative beginning to middle to end. Such a conception of the self is perhaps less unfamiliar than it may appear at first sight. Just because it has played a key part in the cultures which are historically predecessors of our own, it would not be surprising if it turned out to be still an unacknowledged presence in many of our ways of thinking and acting. Hence, it is not inappropriate to begin by scrutinizing some of our most taken for granted, but clearly correct conceptual insights about human actions and selfhood, in order to show how natural it is to think of the self in a narrative mode. It is a conceptual commonplace, both for philosophers and for ordinary agents, that one and the same segment of human behaviors may be correctly characterized in a number of different ways. To the question, what is he doing? The answers may be with equal truth and appropriateness, digging, gardening, taking exercise, preparing for winter, or pleasing his wife. Some of these answers will characterize the agent's intentions, others unintended consequences of his actions, and of these unintended consequences, some may be such that the agent is aware of them and others not. What is important to notice immediately is that any answer to the questions of how we are to understand or to explain a given segment of behavior will presuppose some prior answer to the question of how these different correct answers to the question, what is he doing, are related to each other. For if someone's primary intention is to put the garden in order before the winter, and it is only incidentally the case that in so doing he is taking exercise and pleasing his wife, we have one type of behavior to be explained. But if the agent's primary intention is to please his wife by taking exercise, we have quite another type of behavior to be explained, and we will have to look in a different direction for understanding and explanation. In the first place, the episode has been situated in an annual cycle of domestic activity, and the behavior embodies an intention which presupposes a particular type of household garden setting with the particular narrative history of that setting in which this segment of behavior now becomes an episode. In the second instance, the episode has been situated in the narrative history of a marriage, a very different, even if related, social setting. We cannot, that is to say, characterize behavior independently of intentions, and we cannot characterize intentions independently of the settings which make those intentions intelligible both to agents themselves and to others. I use the word setting here as a relatively inclusive term. A social setting may be an institution. It may be what I have called a practice, or it may be a milieu of some other human kind. But it is central to the notion of a setting, as I am going to understand it, that a setting has a history within which the histories of individual agents not only are, but have to be situated, just because without the setting and its changes through time, the history of the individual agent and his changes through time will be unintelligible. Of course, one and the same piece of behavior may belong to more than one setting. There are at least two different ways in which this may be so. In my earlier example, the agent's activity may be part of the history both of the cycle of the household activity and of his marriage, two histories which have happened to intersect. The household may have its own history stretching back through hundreds of years, as do the histories of some European farms, where the farm has had a life of its own, even though different families have in different periods inhabited it. And the marriage will certainly have its own history, a history which itself presupposes that a particular point has been reached in the history of the institution of marriage. If we are to relate some particular segment of behavior in any precise way to an agent's intentions, and thus to the settings which that agent inhabits, we shall have to understand in a precise way how the variety of correct characterizations of the agent's behavior relate to each other, first by identifying which characteristics refer us to an intention and which do not, and then by classifying further the items in both categories. Where intentions are concerned, we need to know which intention or intentions were primary, that is to say, of which it is the case that, had the agent intended otherwise, he would not have performed that action. Thus, if we know that a man is gardening with the self-avowed purposes of healthful exercise and the pleasing of his wife, we do not yet know how to understand what he is doing until we know the answer to such questions as whether he would continue gardening if he continued to believe that gardening was healthful exercise, but discovered that his gardening no longer pleased his wife, and whether he would continue gardening if he ceased to believe that gardening was healthful exercise, but continued to believe that it pleased his wife, and whether he would continue gardening if he changed his belief on both points. That is to say, we need to know both what certain of his beliefs are and which of them are causally effective, and that is to say, we need to know whether certain contrary to fact hypothetical statements are true or false, and until we know this, we shall not know how to characterize correctly what the agent is doing. Consider another equally trivial example of a set of compatibly correct answers to the question, what is he doing? Writing a sentence, finishing his book, contributing to the debate on the theory of action, trying to get tenure. Here, the intentions can be ordered in terms of the stretch of time to which reference is made. Each of the shorter-term intentions is, and can only be made intelligible by reference to some longer-term intentions, and the characterization of the behavior in terms of the longer-term intentions can only be correct if some of the characterization in terms of shorter-term intentions are also correct. Hence, the behavior is only characterized adequately when we know what the longer and longest-term intentions invoked are and how the shorter-term intentions are related to the longer. Once again, we're involved in writing a narrative history. Intentions thus need to be ordered both causally and temporally, and both orderings will make references to settings, references already made obliquely by such elementary terms as gardening, wife, book, and tenure. Moreover, the correct identification of the agent's beliefs will be an essential constituent of this task. Failure at this point would mean failure in the whole enterprise. The conclusion may seem obvious, but it already entails one important consequence. There is no such thing as behavior to be identified prior to and independently of intentions, beliefs, and settings. Hence, the project of a science of behavior takes on a mysterious and somewhat outre character. It is not that such a science is impossible, but that there is nothing for it to be but a science of uninterpreted physical movements, such as B.F. Skinner aspires to. It is no part of my task here to examine Skinner's problems, but it is worth noting that it is not at all clear what a scientific experiment could be if one were a Skinnerian, since the conception of an experiment is certainly one of intention and belief-informed behavior, and what would be utterly doomed to failure would be the project of science of, say, political behavior, detached from a study of intentions, beliefs, and settings. It is perhaps worth noting that when the expression the behavioral sciences was given its first influential use in a Ford Foundation report of 1953, the term behavior was defined so as to include what were called such subjective behavior as attitudes, beliefs, expectations, motivations, and aspirations, as well as overt acts. But what the report's wording seemed to imply is that it is cataloging two distinct sets of items available for independent study. If the argument so far is correct, then there is only one set of items. Consider what the argument so far implies about the interrelationships of the intentional, the social, and the historical. We identify a particular action only by invoking two kinds of context, implicitly, if not explicitly. We place the agent's intentions, as I have suggested, in causal and temporal order with reference to their role in his or her history, and we also place them with reference to their role in the history of the setting or settings to which they belong. In doing this, in determining what causal efficacy the agent's intentions had in one or more directions, and how long his short-term intentions succeeded or failed to be constitutive of long-term intentions, we ourselves write a further part of these histories. Narrative history of a certain kind turns out to be the basic and essential genre for the characterization of human actions. It is important to be clear how different the standpoint presupposed by the argument so far is from that of those analytic philosophers who have constructed accounts of human actions which make central the notion of a human action. The course of human events is then seen as a complex sequence of individual actions, and a natural question is as follows: how do we individuate human actions? Now there are contexts in which such notions are at home. In the recipes of a cookery book, for instance, actions are individuated in just the way that some analytical philosophers have supposed to be possible for all actions. Take 6 eggs, then break them into a bowl, add flour, salt, sugar, etc. But the point about such sequences is that each element in them is intelligible as an action only as a possible element in a sequence. Moreover, even such a sequence requires a context to be intelligible. If in the middle of my lecture on Kant's ethics I suddenly broke 6 eggs into a bowl and added flour and sugar, proceeding all the way with my Kantian exegesis, I have not, simply in virtue of the fact that I was following a sequence prescribed by Fanny Farmer, performed an intelligible action. To this, it might be retorted that I certainly performed an action or a set of actions, if not an intelligible action. But to this I want to reply that the concept of an intelligible action is a more fundamental concept than that of an action as such. Unintelligible actions are failed candidates for the status of intelligible action, and to lump unintelligible actions and intelligible actions together in a single class of actions, and then to characterize action in terms of what items of both sets have in common, is to make the mistake of ignoring this. It is also to neglect the central importance of the concept of intelligibility. The importance of the concept of intelligibility is closely related to the fact that the most basic distinction of all embedded in our discourse and our practice is in this area, is that between human beings and other beings. Human beings can be held to account for that of which they are the authors. Other beings cannot. To identify an occurrence as an action is in the paradigmatic instances to identify it under a type of description, which enables us to see that occurrence as flowing intelligibly from a human agent's intentions, motives, passions, and purposes. It is therefore to understand an action as something for which someone is accountable, about which it is always appropriate to ask the agent for an intelligible account. When an occurrence is apparently the intended action of a human agent, but nonetheless we cannot so identify it, we are both intellectually and practically baffled. We do not know how to respond. We do not know how to explain. We do not even know how to characterize minimally. An intelligible action. Our distinction between the humanly accountable and the merely natural seems to have broken down. And this kind of bafflement does indeed occur in a number of different kinds of situation. When we enter alien cultures, or even alien social structures within our own culture, in our encounters with certain types of neurotic or psychotic patient, it is indeed the unintelligibility of such patients' actions that leads to their being treated as patients. Actions unintelligible to the agent, as well as to everyone else, are understood rightly as a kind of suffering, but also in everyday situations. Consider an example. I am standing waiting for a bus, and the young man standing next to me suddenly says, "The name of the common wild duck is Hystraconnus biscronus histrionicus." There is no problem as to the meaning of the sentence he uttered. The problem is how to answer the question, what was he doing in uttering it? Suppose he just uttered such sentences at random intervals. This would be one possible form of madness. We would render his action of utterance intelligible if one of the following turned out to be true. He has mistaken me for someone who yesterday had approached him in the library and asked, "Do you by any chance know the Latin name of the common wild duck?" Or he has just come from a session with his psychotherapist, who has urged him to break down his shyness by talking to strangers. But what shall I say? Oh, anything at all. Or he is a Soviet spy, waiting at a prearranged rendezvous and uttering the ill-chosen code sentence which will identify him to his contact. In each case, the act of utterance becomes intelligible by finding its place in a narrative. To this, it may be replied that the supplying of a narrative is not necessary to make an act intelligible. All that is required is that we can identify the relevant type of speech act. For example, he was answering a question, or some purpose served by his utterance. For example, he was trying to attract your attention. But speech acts and purposes too can be intelligible or unintelligible. Suppose that the man at the bus stop explains his act of utterance by saying, I was answering a question. I reply, but I never asked you any question to which that could have been the answer. He says, oh, I know that. Once again, his action becomes unintelligible. And a parallel example could easily be constructed to show that the mere fact that an action serves some purpose of a recognized type is not sufficient to render an action intelligible. Both purposes and speech acts require contexts. The most familiar type of context in and by reference to which speech acts and purposes are rendered intelligible is the conversation. Conversation is so all-pervasive a feature of the human world that it tends to escape philosophical attention. Yet remove conversation from human life, and what would be left? Consider then what is involved in following a conversation and finding it intelligible or unintelligible. To find a conversation intelligible is not the same as to understand it. For a conversation which I overhear may be intelligible, but I may fail to understand it. If I listen to a conversation between two other people, my ability to grasp the thread of the conversation will involve an ability to bring it under some one out of a set of descriptions in which the degree and kind of coherence in the conversation is brought out. A drunken rambling quarrel, a serious intellectual disagreement, a tragic misunderstanding of each other, a comic, even farcical misconstrual of each other's motives, a penetrating interchange of views, a struggle to dominate each other, a trivial exchange of gossip. The use of words such as tragic, comic, and farcical is not marginal to such evaluations. We allocate conversations to genres just as we do literary narratives. Indeed, a conversation is a dramatic work, even if a very short one, in which the participants are not only the actors, but also the joint authors, working out in agreement or disagreement the mode of their production. For it is not just that conversations belong to genres in just the way that plays and novels do, but they have beginnings, middles, and endings just as do literary works. They embody reversals and recognitions. They move towards and away from climaxes. There may be within a longer conversation digressions and subplots. Indeed, digressions within digressions and subplots within subplots. But if this is true of conversations, it is true also mutatis mutandis of battles, chess games, courtships, philosophy seminars, families at the dinner table, businessmen negotiating contracts, that is, of human transactions in general. For conversation, understood widely enough, is the form of human transactions in general. Conversational behavior is not a special sort or aspect of human behavior, even though the forms of language using and of human life are such that the deeds of others speak for them as much as do their words, for that is possible only because they are deeds of those who have words. I am presenting both conversations in particular, then, as human actions in general, as enacted narratives. Narrative is not the work of poets, dramatists, and novelists reflecting upon events which have no narrative order before one was imposed by the singer or the writer. Narrative form is neither disguise nor decoration. Barbara Hardy has written that we dream in narrative, daydream in narrative, remember, anticipate, hope, despair, believe, doubt, plan, revise, criticize, construct, gossip, learn, hate, and love by narrative, in arguing the same point. At the beginning of this chapter, I argued that in successfully identifying and understanding what someone else is doing, we always move towards playing a particular episode in the context of a set of narrative histories. Histories both of the individuals concerned and of the setting in which they act and suffer. It is now becoming clear that we render the actions of others intelligible in this way because action itself has a basically historical character. It is because we all live out narratives in our lives, and because we understand our own lives in terms of the narratives that we live out, that the form of a narrative is appropriate for understanding the actions of others. Stories are lived before they are told, except in the case of fiction. This has, of course, been denied in recent debates. Louis O. Mink, quarreling with Barbara Hardy's view, has asserted, stories are not lived, but told. Life has no beginnings, middles, or ends. There are meanings, but the start of an affair belongs to the story we tell ourselves later, and there are partings, but final partings only in the story. There are hopes, plans, battles, and ideas, but only in retrospective stories are hopes unfulfilled, plans miscarried, battles decisive, and ideas seminal. Only in the story is it America which Columbus discovers, and only in the story is the kingdom lost for want of a nail. What are we to say to this? Certainly, we must agree that it is only retrospectively that hopes can be characterized as unfulfilled or battles as decisive and so on. But we so characterize them in life as much as in art. And to someone who says that in life there are no endings, or that final partings take place only in stories, one is tempted to reply, but have you never heard of death? Homer did not have to tell the tale of Hector before Andromache could lament unfulfilled hope and final parting. There are countless Hectors and countless Andromaches whose lives embodied the form of their Homeric namesakes, but who never came to the attention of any poet. What is true is that in taking an event as a beginning or an ending, we bestow a significance upon it which may be debatable. Did the Roman Republic end with the death of Julius Caesar, or at Philippi, or with the founding of the Principate? The answer is surely that, like Charles II, it was a long time a-dying. But this answer implies the reality of its ending as much as do any of the former. There is a crucial sense in which the Principate of Augustus, or the taking of the oath in the tennis court, or the decision to construct an atomic bomb at Los Alamos constitute beginnings, the peace of 404 BC, the abolition of the Scottish Parliament, and the Battle of Waterloo equally constitute endings, while there are many events which are both endings and beginnings. As with beginnings, middles, and endings, so also with genres and with the phenomenon of embedding. Consider the question of to what genre the life of Thomas Becket belongs. A question which has to be asked and answered before we can decide how it is to be written. On Mink's paradoxical view, this question could not be asked until after the life had been written. In some of the medieval versions, Thomas's career is presented in terms of the canons of medieval hagiography. In the Icelandic Thomas saga, he is presented as a saga hero. In Dom David Knowles's modern biography, the story is a tragedy, the tragic relationship of Thomas and Henry II, each of whom satisfies Aristotle's demand that the hero be a great man with a fatal flaw. Now it clearly makes sense to ask who is right, if anyone. The monk William of Canterbury, the author of the saga, or the Cambridge Regis Professor Emeritus? The answer appears to be clearly the last. The true genre of the life is neither hagiography nor saga, but tragedy. So, of such modern narrative subjects as the life of Trotsky or that of Lenin, of the history of the Soviet Communist Party, or the American presidency, we may also ask, to what genre do their history belong? And this is the same question as, what type of account of their history will be both true and intelligible? Or consider again how one narrative may be embedded in another. In both plays and novels there are well-known examples. The play within the play in Hamlet, Wandering Willie's Tale in Red Gauntlet, Erinna's narrative to Dido in Book 2 of the Aeneid, and so on. But there are equally well-known examples in regular life. Consider again the way in which the career of Becket as Archbishop and Chancellor is embodied within the reign of Henry II, or the way in which the tragic life of Mary Stuart is embodied in that of Elizabeth I, or the history of the Confederacy within the history of the United States. Someone may discover, or not discover, that he or she is a character in a number of narratives at the same time, some of them embedded in others. Or again, what seemed to be an intelligible narrative in which one was playing a part may be transformed wholly or partly into a story of unintelligible episodes. This last is what happened to Kafka's character K in both The Trial and The Castle. It is no accident that Kafka could not end his novels, for notion of an ending, like that of a beginning, has its sense only in terms of intelligible narrative. I spoke earlier of the agent as not only an actor, but an author. Now I must emphasize that what the agent is able to do and say intelligibly as an actor is deeply affected by the fact that we are never more, and sometimes less, than the co-authors of our own narratives. Only in fantasy do we live what story we please. In life, as both Aristotle and Engels noted, we are always under certain constraints. We enter upon a stage which we do not design, and we find ourselves part of an action that was not of our making. Each of us being a main character in his own drama plays subordinate parts in the dramas of others, and each drama constrains the others. In my drama, perhaps, I am Hamlet or Iago, or at least the swineherd who may yet become a prince. But to you I am only a gentleman, or at best second murderer, while you are my Polonius or my gravedigger, but your own hero. Each of our dramas exerts constraints on each other's, making the whole different from the parts, but still dramatic. It is considerations as complex as these which are involved in making the notion of intelligibility the conceptual connecting link between the notion of action and that of narrative. Once we have understood its importance, the claim that the content of an action is secondary to that of an intelligible action will perhaps appear less bizarre, and so too will the claim that the notion of an action, while of the highest practical importance, is always a potentially misleading abstraction. Unaction is a moment in a possible or actual history, or in a number of such histories. The notion of a history is as fundamental a notion as the notion of an action. Each requires the other. But I cannot say this without noticing that it is precisely this that Sartre denies, as indeed his whole theory of the self, which captures so well the spirit of modernity, requires that he should. In La Nausée, Sartre makes Antonin Roquetin argue not just what Mink argues, that narrative is very different from life, but that to present human life in the form of a narrative is always to falsify it. There are not, and there cannot be, any true stories. Human life is composed of discrete actions which lead nowhere, which have no order. The storyteller imposes on human events retrospectively an order which they did not have while they were lived. Clearly, if Sartre Roquetin is right, I speak of Sartre Roquetin to distinguish him from such other well-known characters as Sartre Heidegger and Sartre Marx, my central contention must be mistaken. There is nonetheless an important point of agreement between my thesis and that of Sartre Roquetin. We agree in identifying the intelligibility of an action with its place in a narrative sequence. Only Sartre Roquetin takes it that human actions are such unintelligible occurrences. It is to a realization of the metaphysical implications of this that Roquetin is brought in the course of the novel, and the practical effect upon him is to bring an end to his own project of writing a historical biography. This project no longer makes sense. Either he will write what is true, or he will write an intelligible history, but the one possibility excludes the other. Is Sartre Roquetin right? We can discover what is wrong with Sartre's thesis in either of two ways. One is to ask, what would human actions, deprived of any falsifying narrative order, be like? Sartre himself never answers this question. It is striking that in order to show that we are no true narratives, he himself writes a narrative, albeit a fictional one. But the only picture that I find myself able to form of human nature an sich, prior to the alleged misinterpretation by narrative, is the kind of dislocated sequence which Dr. Johnson offers us in his notes of his travels in France. Quote, "There we waited on the ladies, Morville's Spain. Contrary towns, all beggars. As Dijon he could not find the way to Orleans. Crossroads of France very bad. 5 soldiers, women, soldiers escaped. The colonel would not lose 5 men for the sake of 1 woman. The magistrate cannot seize a soldier but by the colonel's permission, etc., etc." Quoted in Hobsbawm, 1973, page 32. What this suggests is what I take to be true, namely that the characterization of actions allegedly prior to any narrative form being imposed upon them will always turn out to be the presentation of what are plainly the disjointed parts of some possible narrative. We can also approach the question in another way. What I have called a history is an enacted dramatic narrative in which the characters are also the authors. The characters, of course, never start literally ab initio. They plunge in media res, the beginning of what their story already made for them by what and who has gone before. But when Julian Grenfell or Edward Thomas went off to France in the 1914 to 1918 war, they no less enacted a narrative than did Menelaus or Odysseus when they went off. The difference between imaginary characters and real ones is not in the narrative form of what they do. It is in the degree of their authorship of that form and of their own deeds. Of course, just as they do not begin where they please, they cannot go on exactly as they please either. Each character is constrained by the actions of others and by the social settings presupposed in his and their actions, a point forcefully made by Marx in the classical, if not entirely satisfactory account of human life as an active dramatic narrative, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. I call Marx's account less than satisfactory, partly because he wishes to present the narrative of human social life in a way that will be compatible with the view of the life as law-governed and predictable in a particular way. But it is crucial that at any given point in an enacted dramatic narrative, we do not know what will happen next. The kind of unpredictability for which I argued in Chapter 8 is required by the narrative structure of human life, and the empirical generalizations and explorations which social scientists discover provide a kind of understanding of human life which is perfectly compatible with that structure. This unpredictability coexists with a second crucial characteristic of all lived narratives, a certain teleological character. We live out our lives, both individually and in our relationships with each other, in the light of certain conceptions of a possible shared future, a future in which certain possibilities beckon us forward and others repel us. Some seem already foreclosed and others perhaps inevitable. There is no present which is not informed by some image of some future, and an image of the future which always presents itself in the form of a telos, or of a variety of ends or goals, towards which we are either moving or failing to move in the present. Unpredictability and teleology therefore coexist as parts of our lives. Like characters in a fictional narrative, we do not know what will happen next, but nonetheless our lives have a certain form which projects itself towards our future. Thus, the narratives which we live out have both an unpredictable and a partially teleological character. If the narrative of our individual and social lives is to continue intelligibly, and each type of narrative may lapse into unintelligibility, it is always and both the case that there are constraints on how the story can continue, and that within those constraints there are indefinitely many ways that it can continue. A central thesis then begins to emerge. Man is, in his actions and practice, as well as in his fictions, essentially a storytelling animal. He is not essentially, but becomes through his history a teller of stories that aspire to truth. But the key question for men is not about their own authorship. I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question, of what story or stories do I find myself a part? We enter human society, that is, with one or more imputed characters, roles into which we have been drafted, and we have to learn what they are in order to be able to understand how others respond to us and how our responses to them are apt to be construed. It is through hearing stories about wicked stepmothers, lost children, good but misguided kings, wolves that suckle twin boys, youngest sons who receive no inheritance but must make their own way in the world, and eldest sons who waste their inheritance on riotous living and go into exile to live with the swine, that children learn or mislearn both what a child and what a parent is, what the cast of characters may be in the drama into which they have been born, and what the ways of the world are. Deprive children of stories, and you leave them unscripted, anxious stutterers in their actions and in their words. Hence, there is no way to give us an understanding of any society, including our own, except through the stock of stories which constitute its initial dramatic resources. Mythology, in its original sense, is at the heart of things. Vico was right, and so was Joyce. And so, too, of course, is that moral tradition from heroic society to its medieval heirs, according to which the telling of stories has a key part in educating us into the virtues. I suggested earlier that an action is always an episode in a particular history. I would now like to make a related suggestion about another concept, that of personal identity. Derek Parfit and others have recently drawn our attention to the contest between the criteria of strict identity, which is an all-or-nothing matter. Either the Tichborne claimant is the last Tichborne heir, or he is not. Either all the properties of the last heirs belonging to the claimant, either all the properties of the last heir belonging to the claimant, or the claimant is not the heir. Leibniz's law applies. And the psychological constituents of personality, which are a matter of more or less. Am I the same man at 50 as I was at 40 in respect of memory, intellectual powers, critical responses, more or less? But what is crucial to human beings, as crucial as characters in enacted narratives, is that, possessing only the resources of psychological continuity, we have to be able to respond to the imputation of strict identity. I am forever what I have been at any time for others, and I may at any time be called upon to answer for it, no matter how changed I may be now. There is no way of founding my identity or lack of it in the psychological continuity or discontinuity of the self. The self inhabits a character whose unity is given as the unity of a character. Once again, there is a crucial disagreement with empiricists or analytical philosophers on the one hand and with existentialists on the other. Empiricists, such as Locke or Hume, tried to give an account of personal identity solely in terms of psychological states or events. Analytical philosophers, in so many ways their heirs as well as their critics, have wrestled with the connection between those states and events and strict identity understood in terms of Leibniz's law. Both have failed to see that a background has been omitted, the lack of which makes the problems insoluble. That background is provided by the concept of a story and of that kind of unity of character which a story requires. Just as history is not a sequence of actions, but the concept of an action is that of a moment in an actual or possible history, abstracted for some purpose from that history, so the characters in a history are not a collection of persons, but the concept of a person is that of a character abstracted from a history. What the narrative concept of selfhood requires is thus twofold. On the one hand, I am what I may justifiably be taken by others to be, in the course of living out a story that runs from my birth to my death. I am the subject of a history that is my own and no one else's, that has its own peculiar meaning. When someone complains, as do some of those who attempt or commit suicide, that his or her life is meaningless, he or she is often and perhaps characteristically complaining that the narrative of their life has become unintelligible to them, that it lacks any point, any movement towards a climax or telos. Hence, the point of doing any one thing rather than another at crucial junctures in their lives seems to such a person to have been lost. To be the subject of a narrative that runs from one's birth to one's death is, I remarked earlier, to be accountable for the actions and experiences which compose a narratable life. It is, that is, to be open to being asked to give a certain kind of account of what one did or what happened to one or what one witnessed at any earlier point in one's life than the time at which the question is posed. Of course, someone may have forgiven or suffered, someone may have forgotten or suffered brain damage, or simply not attended sufficiently at the relevant time to be able to give the relevant account. But to say someone under some one description, the prisoner of the Chateau de L'If, that he is the same person as someone characterized quite differently, the Count of Monte Cristo, is precisely to say that it makes sense to ask him to give an intelligible narrative account, enabling us to understand how he could at different times and different places be one and the same person, and yet be so differently characterized. Thus, personal identity is just that identity presupposed by the unity of the character which the unity of a narrative requires. Without such unity, there would not be subjects of whom stories could be told. The other aspect of narrative selfhood is correlative. I am not only accountable, I am one who can always ask others for an account, who can put others to the question. I am part of their story as they are part of mine. The narrative of any one life is part of an interlocking set of narratives. Moreover, this asking for and giving of accounts itself plays an important part in constituting narratives. Asking you what you did and why, saying what I did and why, pondering the differences between your account of what I did and my account of what I did, and vice versa. These are essential constituents of all but the very simplest and barest of narratives. Thus, without the accountability of the self, those trains of events that constitute all but the simplest and barest of narratives could not occur. And without that same accountability, narratives would lack that continuity required to make both them and their actions that constitute them intelligible. It is important to notice that I am not arguing that the concepts of narrative or of intelligibility or of accountability are more fundamental than that of personal identity. The concepts of narrative, intelligibility, and accountability presuppose the applicability of the concept of personal identity, just as it presupposes their applicability, and just as indeed each of these three presupposes the applicability of the two others. The relationship is one of mutual presupposition. It does follow, of course, that all attempts to elucidate the notion of personal identity independently of and in isolation from the notions of narrative, intelligibility, and accountability are bound to fail, as all such attempts have. It is now possible to return to the question from which this inquiry into the nature of human action and identity started. That is, in what does the unity of an individual life consist? The answer is that its unity is the unity of a narrative embodied in a single life. To ask, what is the good for me, is to ask how best I might live out that unity and bring it to completion. To ask, what is the good for man, is to ask what all answers to the former question must have in common. But now it is important to emphasize that it is the systematic asking of these two questions and the attempt to answer them in deed as well as in word which provide the moral life with its unity. The unity of a human life is the unity of a narrative quest. Quests sometimes fail, are frustrated, abandoned, or dissipated into distractions, and human lives may in all these ways also fail. But the only criteria for success or failure in a human life as a whole are the criteria of success or failure in a narrated or to-be-narrated quest. A quest for what? Two key features of the medieval conception of a quest need to be recalled. The first is that without some at least partially determinate conception of the final telos, there could not be any beginning to a quest. Some conceptions of the good for man are required. Whence is such a conception to be drawn? Precisely from those questions which led us to attempt to transcend that limited conception of the virtues which is available in and through practice. It is in looking for a conception of the good which will enable us to order other goods, for a conception of the good which will enable us to extend our understanding of the purpose and content of the virtues, for a conception of the good which will enable us to understand the place of integrity and constancy in life, that we will initially define the kind of life which is a quest for the good. But secondly, It is clear the medieval conception of a quest is not at all that of a search for something already adequately characterized, as miners search for gold or geologists for oil. It is the course of the quest, and only through encountering and coping with the various particular harms, dangers, temptations, and distractions which provide any quest with its episodes and incidents, that the goal of the quest is finally to be understood. A quest is always an education, both as to the character of that which is sought and in self-knowledge. The virtues, therefore, are to be understood as those dispositions which will not only sustain practices and enable us to achieve the goods internal to practices, but which will also sustain us in the relevant kind of quest for the good, by enabling us to overcome the harms, dangers, temptations, and distractions which we encounter, and which will furnish us with increasing self-knowledge and increasing knowledge of the good. The catalogue of the virtues will therefore include the virtues required to sustain the kind of households and the kind of political communities in which men and women can seek for the good together, and the virtues necessary for philosophical inquiry about the character of the good. We have then arrived at a provisional conclusion about the good life for man. The good life for man is the life spent in seeking for the good life for man, and the virtues necessary for the seeking are those which will enable us to understand what more and what else the good life for man is. We have also completed the second stage in our account of the virtues, by situating them in relation to the good life for man, and not only in relation to practices. But our inquiry requires a third stage. For I am never able to seek for the good or exercise the virtues only qua individual. This is partly because what it is to live the good life concretely varies from circumstance to circumstance, even when it is one and the same conception of the good life and one and the same set of virtues which are being embodied in a human life. What the good life is for a 5th century Athenian general will not be the same as what it is for a medieval nun or a 17th century farmer. But it is not just that different individuals live in different social circumstances. It is also that we all approach our own circumstances as bearers of a particular social identity. I am someone's son or daughter, someone else's cousin or uncle. I am a citizen of this or that city, a member of this or that guild or profession. I belong to this clan, that tribe, this nation. Hence, what is good for me has to be the good for one who inhabits these roles. As such, I inherit from the past of my family, my city, my tribe, my nation, a variety of debts, inheritances, rightful expectations, and obligations. These constitute the given of my life, my moral starting point. This is in part what gives my life its own moral particularity. This thought is likely to appear alien and even surprising from the standpoint of modern individualism. From the standpoint of individualism, I am what I myself choose to be. I can always, if I wish to, put in question what are taken to be the merely contingent social features of my existence. I may biologically be my father's son, but I cannot be held responsible for what he did unless I choose implicitly or explicitly to assume such responsibility. I may legally be a citizen of a certain country, but I cannot be held responsible for what my country does or has done unless I choose implicitly or explicitly to assume such responsibility. Such individualism is expressed by those modern Americans who deny any responsibility for the effects of slavery upon black Americans, saying, "I never owned any slaves." It is more subtly the standpoint of those other modern Americans who accept a nicely calculated responsibility for such effects, measured precisely by the benefits they themselves as individuals have indirectly received from slavery. In both cases, being an American is not in itself taken to be part of the moral identity of the individual. And of course, there is nothing peculiar to modern Americans in this attitude. The Englishman who says, "I never did any wrong to Ireland, why bring up that old history as though it had something to do with me?" Or the young German who believes that being born after 1945 means that what Nazis did to Jews has no more relevance to his relationship to his Jewish contemporaries, exhibit the same attitude, that according to which the self is detachable from its social and historical roles and statuses. And the self so detached is of course a self very much at home in either Sartre's or Goffman's perspective, a self that can have no history. The contrast with the narrative view of the self is clear, for the story of my life is always embedded in the story of those communities from which I derive my identity. I am born with a past, and to try to cut myself off from the past in the individualist mode is to deform my present relationships. The possession of a historical identity and the possession of a social identity coincide. Notice that rebellion against my identity is always one possible mode of expressing it. Notice also that the fact that the self has to find its moral identity in and through its membership in communities such as those of the family, the neighborhood, the city, and the tribe does not entail that the self has to accept the moral limitations of the particularity of those forms of community. Without those moral particularities to begin from, there would never be anywhere to begin. But it is in moving forward from such particularity that the search for the good, for the universal consists. Yet particularity can never be simply left behind or obliterated. The notion of escaping from it into a realm of entirely universal maxims which belong to man as such, whether in its 18th century Kantian form or in the presentation of some modern analytical moral philosophies, is an illusion, and an illusion with painful consequences. When men and women identify what are in fact their partial and particular causes too easily and too completely with the cause of some universal principle, they usually behave worse than they would do otherwise. What I am, therefore, is in key part what I inherit, a specific past that is present to some degree in my present. I find myself part of a history, and that is, generally to say, whether I like it or not, whether I recognize it or not, one of the bearers of a tradition. It was important when I characterized the concept of a practice to notice that practices always have histories, and that any given moment what a practice is, and that at any given moment what a practice is depends on a mode of understanding it, which has been transmitted often through many generations, and thus, insofar as the virtues sustain the relationships required for practices, they have to sustain relationships to the past and to the future, as well as in the present. But the traditions through which particular practices are transmitted and reshaped never exist in isolation for larger social traditions. What constitutes such traditions? We are apt to be misled here by the ideological uses to which the concept of a tradition has been put by conservative political theorists. Characteristically, such theorists have followed Burke in contrasting tradition with reason and the stability of tradition with conflict. Both contrasts obfuscate, for all reasoning takes place within the context of some traditional mode of thought, transcending through criticism and invention the limitations of what had hitherto been reasoned in that tradition. This is as true of modern physics as of medieval logic. Moreover, when a tradition is in good order, it is always partially constituted by an argument about the goods, the pursuit of which gives to that tradition its particular point and purpose. So when an institution, a university, say, or a farm or a hospital, is the bearer of a tradition of practice or practices, its common life will be partly, but in a centrally important way, constituted by a continuous argument as to what a university is and ought to be, or what good farming is, or what good medicine is. Traditions, when vital, embody continuities of conflict. Indeed, when a tradition becomes Burkean, it is always dying or dead. The individualism of modernity could, of course, find no use for the notion of tradition within its own conceptual scheme, except as an adversary notion. It therefore all too willingly abandoned it to the Burkeans, who, faithful to Burke's own allegiance, tried to combine adherence in politics to a conception of tradition which would vindicate the oligarchical revolution of property of 1688, and adherence in economics to the doctrine and institutions of the free market. The theoretical incoherence of this mismatch did not deprive it of ideological usefulness, but the outcome has been that modern conservatives are for the most part engaged in conserving only older rather than later versions of liberal individualism. Their own core doctrine is as liberal and as individualist as that of self-avowed liberals. A living tradition, then, is an historically extended, socially embodied argument, and an argument precisely in part about the goods which constitute that tradition. Within a tradition, the pursuit of goods extends through generations, sometimes through many generations. Hence, the individual's search for his or her good is generally and characteristically conducted within a context defined by those traditions of which the individual's life is a part. And this is true both of those goods which are internal to practices and of the goods of a single life. Once again, the narrative phenomenon of embedding is crucial. The history of a practice in our time is generally and characteristically embedded in and made intelligible in terms of the larger and longer history of the tradition through which the practice in its present form was conveyed to us. The history of each of our own lives is generally and characteristically embedded in and made intelligible in terms of the larger and longer histories of a number of traditions. I have to say generally and characteristically rather than always, for traditions decay, disintegrate, and disappear. What then sustains and strengthens traditions? What weakens and destroys them? The answer in key part is the exercise or lack of exercise of the relevant virtues. The virtues find their point and purpose not only in sustaining those relationships necessary if the variety of goods internal to practices are to be achieved, and not only in sustaining the form of an individual life in which that individual may seek out his or her good as the good of his or her whole life, but also in sustaining those traditions which provide both practices and individual lives with their necessary historical context. Lack of justice, lack of truthfulness, lack of courage, lack of the relevant intellectual virtues, these corrupt traditions, just as they do those institutions and practices which derive their life from the traditions of which they are the contemporary embodiments. To recognize this is, of course, also to recognize the existence of an additional virtue, one of whose importance is perhaps most obvious when it is least present, the virtue of having an adequate sense of the traditions to which one belongs or which confront one. This virtue is not to be confused with any form of conservative antiquarianism. I am not praising those who choose the conventional conservative role of lantador temporis acti. It is rather the case that an adequate sense of tradition manifests itself in a grasp of those future possibilities which the past has made available to the present. Living traditions, just because they continue a not yet completed narrative, confront a future whose determinate and determinable character, so far as it possesses any, derives from the past. In practical reasoning, the possession of this virtue is not manifested so much in the knowledge of a set of generalizations or maxims which may provide our practical inferences with major premises. Its presence or absence rather appears in the kind of capacity for judgment which the agent possesses in knowing how to select among the relevant stack of maxims and how to apply them in particular situations. Cardinal Pole possessed it. Mary Tudor did not. Montrose possessed it. Charles I did not. What Cardinal Pole and the Marquis of Montrose possessed were in fact those virtues which enabled their possessors to pursue both their own good and the good of the tradition of which they are the bearers, even in situations defined by the necessity of tragic, dilemmatic choice. Such choices, understood in the context of the tradition of the virtues, are very different from those which face the modern adherents of rival and incommensurable moral premises in the debates which I wrote about in Chapter 2. Wherein does the difference lie? It has often been suggested, by J.L. Austen, for example, that either we can admit the existence of rival and contingently incompatible goods which make incompatible claims to our practical allegiances, or we can believe in some determinate conception of the good life for man, but that these are mutually exclusive alternatives. No one can consistently hold both these views. What this contention is blind to is that there may be better or worse ways for individuals to live through the tragic confrontation of good with good, and that to know what the good life for man is may require knowing what are the better and what are the worse ways of living in and through such situations. Nothing a priori rules out this possibility, and this suggests that within a view such as Austen's there is concealed an unacknowledged empirical premise about the character of tragic situations. One way in which the choice between rival goods in a tragic situation differs from the modern choice between incommensurable moral premises is that both of the alternative courses of action which confront the individual have to be recognized as leading to some authentic and substantial good. By choosing one, I do nothing to diminish or derogate from the claim upon me of the other, and therefore, whatever I do, I shall have left undone what I ought to have done. The tragic protagonist, unlike the moral agent, as depicted by Sartre or Hare, is not choosing between allegiance to one moral principle rather than another, nor is he or she deciding upon some principle of priority between moral principles. Hence the ought involved has a different meaning and force from the ought in moral principles understood in a modern way. For the tragic protagonist cannot do everything that he or she ought to do. This ought, unlike Kant's, does not imply can. Moreover, any attempt to map the logic of such ought assertions onto some modal calculus, so as to produce a version of deontic logic, has to fail. See, from a very different point of view, Bos von Frossen, 1973. Yet it is clear that the moral task of the tragic protagonist may be performed better or worse, independently of the choice between alternatives that he or she makes. Ex hypothesi, he or she has no right choice to make. The tragic protagonist may behave heroically or unheroically, generously or ungenerously, gracefully or gracelessly, prudently or imprudently. To perform his or her task better rather than worse will be to do what is better for him or her, qua individual, and qua parent or child, or qua citizen, or member of a profession, perhaps qua some or all of these. The existence of tragic dilemmas casts no doubt upon, and provides no counterexample to, the thesis that assertions of the form, to do this in this way would be better for X and or for his or her family, city, or profession, are susceptible to objective truth and falsity, any more than the existence of alternative and contingently incompatible forms of medical treatment casts doubt on the thesis that assertions of the form, to undergo his medical treatment in this way would be better for X and or his or her family, are susceptible of objective truth and falsity. See from a different point of view the illuminating discussion in Samuel Guttelplan, 1979 to 1980, pages 61 to 80. The presupposition of this objectivity is, of course, that we can understand the notion of good for X and cognate notions in terms of some conception of the unity of X's life. What is better or worse for X depends upon the character of that intelligible narrative which provides X's life with its unity. Unsurprisingly, it is the lack of any such unifying conception of human life which underlies modern denials of the factual character of moral judgments, and more especially of those judgments which ascribe virtues or vices to individuals. I argued earlier that every moral philosophy has some particular sociology as its counterpart. What I have tried to spell out in this chapter is the kind of understanding of social life which the tradition of the virtues requires, a kind of understanding very different from those dominant in the culture of bureaucratic individualism. Within that culture, conceptions of the virtues become marginal, and the tradition of the virtues remains central only in the lives of social groups whose existence is on the margins of the central culture. Within the central culture of liberal or bureaucratic individualism, new conceptions of the virtues emerge, and the concept of a virtue is itself transformed. To the history of that transformation I therefore now turn, for we shall only understand the tradition of the virtues fully if we understand to what kind of degeneration it has proved liable. Chapter 16. From the virtues to virtue and after virtue. Near the beginning of the book, I suggested that the interminable and unsettlable character of so many contemporary moral debate, of so much contemporary moral debate, arises from the variety of heterogeneous and incommensurable concepts which inform the major premises from which the protagonists in such debates argue. In this conceptual melange, there are to be found jostling with such modern concepts as those of utility and rights, a variety of virtue concepts functioning in a variety of different ways. What is lacking, however, is any clear consensus, either as to the place of virtue concepts relative to other moral concepts, or as to which dispositions are to be included within the catalogue of the virtues or the requirements imposed by particular virtues. Within particular modern subcultures, of course, versions of the traditional scheme of the virtues survive, but the conditions of contemporary public debate are such that when the representative voices of these subcultures try to participate in it, they are all too easily interpreted and misinterpreted in terms of the pluralism which threatens to submerge us all. This misinterpretation is the outcome of a very long history from the Middle Ages until the present, during which the dominant lists of the virtues have changed. The conception of individual virtues has changed, and the concept of a virtue itself has become other than what it was. It could scarcely have happened otherwise. The two concepts which, as I have argued in the immediately preceding chapters, provide the necessary background for a traditional account of the virtues, the concept of narrative unity and the concept of a practice, were themselves displaced during the same period. Literary historians, from Auerbach to John Gardner, have traced the way in which the cultural place of narrative has been diminished and the modes of interpretation of narrative have been transformed until it has become possible for modern theorists to differ as different as Sartre, whose views I have already discussed, and William Gass, to understand the form of narrative not as that which connects storytelling with the form of human life, but precisely as that which segregates narrative from life, which confines it to what is taken to be a separate and distinctive realm of art. The contrast, indeed the opposition between art and life, which is often in fact the premise rather than the conclusion of such theorists, provides a way of exempting art, including narrative, from its moral tasks. And the relegation of art by modernity to the status of an essentially minority activity and interest further helps to protect us from any narrative understanding of ourselves. Yet since such an understanding cannot be finally and completely expelled without expelling life itself, it continually recurs within art. In the realistic novels of the 19th century, in the movies of the 20th century, in the half-suppressed background plotline which lends coherence to the reading of each morning's newspaper. Nonetheless, to think of a human life as a narrative unity is to think in a way alien to the dominant individualist and bureaucratic modes of modern culture. Moreover, the concept of a practice with goods internal to itself, understood as I have tried to understand it, is similarly removed to the margins of our lives. When I first introduced that notion, I did so in terms of examples drawn from arts, sciences, and games, remarking that the creation and recreation of human community in families, households, tribes, cities, and kingdoms was taken to be, in the same sense, a type of practice in the ancient and medieval periods, but not in the modern world. Politics, as Aristotle conceives it, is a practice with goods internal to itself. Politics, as James Mill conceives it, is not. Moreover, the kind of work done by the vast majority of the inhabitants of the modern world cannot be understood in terms of the nature of a practice with goods internal to itself, and for very good reason. One of the key moments in the creation of modernity occurs when production moves outside the household. So long as productive work occurs within the structure of households, it is easy and right to understand that work as part of the sustaining of the community of the household and of those wider forms of community which the household in turn sustains. As, and to the extent that, work moves outside the household and is put to the service of impersonal capital, the realm of work tends to become separated from everything but the service of biological survival and the reproduction of the labor force on the one hand, and that of institutionalized acquisitiveness on the other. Pleonexia, a vice in the Aristotelian scheme, is now the driving force of modern productive work. The means-end relationships embodied for the most part in such work, on a production line, for example, are necessarily external to the goods which those who work seek. Such work, too, has consequently been expelled from the realm of practices with goods internal to themselves. and correspondingly practices have in turn been removed to the margins of social and cultural life. Arts, sciences, and games are taken to be work only for a minority of specialists. The rest of us may receive incidental benefits in our leisure time only as spectators or consumers. Where the notion of engagement in a practice was only socially central, the notion of aesthetic consumption now is, at least for the majority. Thus, the historical process by and through which the aesthete, the bureaucratic manager, the essential instrument for organizing modern work, and their social kindred become the central characters of modern society, a process which I described even if too briefly in Chapter 3, and the historical process by which the narrative understanding of the unity of human life and the concept of a practice were expelled to the margins of modern culture turn out to be one and the same. It is a history, one aspect of which is the transformation of forms of social life, the continuously re-established dominance of markets, factories, and finally bureaucracies over individuals themselves, sometimes conceived of as independent rational beings, prescribing their moral standpoint to themselves, and sometimes as economic products of circumstances whose happiness must be contrived for them. And it is a history, another aspect of which is that very transformation of the virtues in conception and practice with which I am now concerned. For if you withdraw those background concepts of the narrative unity of human life and of a practice with goods internal to it from those areas in which human life is for the most part lived out, what is there left for the virtues to become? That explicit and thoroughgoing rejection of Aristotelianism, which was the counterpart at the level of philosophy to those social changes whose outcome was to deprive the virtues of their cultural background, made it impossible by the end of the 17th century to supply anything like a traditional account or justification of the virtues. Yet the praise and practice of the virtues still pervaded social life, often in highly traditional ways, even though there were quite new problems for anyone wishing to give a systematic account or justification of their place in that life. There was indeed one distinctly new way open to understand the virtues once they had been severed from their traditional context in thought and practice, and that is as dispositions related in either of two alternative ways to the psychology of that newly invented social institution, the individual. Either the virtues, or some of them, could be understood as expressions of the natural passions of the individual, or they, or some of them, could be understood as dispositions necessary to curb and to limit the destructive effect of some of these natural passions. It was in the 17th and 18th centuries that morality came generally to be understood as offering a solution to the problems posed by human egoism, and that the content of morality came to be largely equated with altruism. For it was in that same period that men came to be thought of as some dangerous measure egoistic by nature, and it is only once we think of mankind as by nature dangerously egoistic that altruism becomes at once socially necessary and yet apparently impossible, and if and when it occurs, inexplicable. On the traditional Aristotelian view, such problems do not arise. For what education in the virtues teaches me is that my good as a man is one and the same as the good of those with whom I am bound up in human community. There is no way of my pursuing my good which is necessarily antagonistic to you pursuing yours, because the good is neither mine peculiarly nor yours peculiarly. Goods are not private property. Hence, Aristotle's definition of friendship, the fundamental form of human relationships, is in terms of shared goods. The egoist is thus, in the ancient and medieval world, always someone who has made a fundamental mistake about where his own good lies, and someone who has thus, and to that extent, excluded himself from human relationships. For many 17th and 18th century thinkers, however, the notion of a shared good for men is an Aristotelian chimera. Each man by nature seeks to satisfy his own desires. But if so, there are at least strong reasons for supposing that a mutually destructive anarchy will ensue, unless desires are limited by a more intelligent version of egoism. It is in the context of the consideration of these grounds that a great deal of 17th and 18th century thinking about the virtues takes place. So David Hume, for example, has to distinguish between the natural virtues, virtues which are qualities useful or agreeable or both to the man whose passions and desires are normally constituted, and the artificial virtues which are socially and culturally constructed to inhibit the expression of these passions and desires, which would serve what we usually take to be our self-interest in a socially destructive way. We naturally find useful and agreeable to ourselves generosity in others. We artificially inculcate in ourselves and others a regard for the rules of justice, even though to obey these rules may not always be to our immediate interest. But why should we find agreeable in certain qualities in others which are not useful to us? But why should we find agreeable certain qualities in others which are not useful to us? Hume is sure that we do. And why should we obey rules on occasions when it is not to our interest to do so? Hume's answers to these questions reveal the underlying weakness of his account, for he tries to conclude in the treatise that it is to our long-term advantage to be just, when all that his premises warrant is the younger Remus's conclusion that it is often to our long-term advantage that people in general should be just. And he has to invoke, to some degree in the treatise, and more strongly in the inquiry, what he calls the communicated passion of sympathy. We find it agreeable that some quality is agreeable to others because we are so constructed that we naturally sympathize with those others. The younger Remus's answer would have been, sometimes we do, and sometimes we do not. And when we do not, why should we? The importance of recalling in the form of objections to Hume's thesis those self-doubts which Diderot put in Remus's mouth is not only, however, a matter of Hume's inability to transcend the 18th century's egoistic presuppositions. What they point to is a more fundamental weakness which becomes explicit when we consider Hume's attitude to rival tables of virtues. On the one hand, Hume sometimes writes as if the knowledge of what is virtuous and what is vicious is a matter of simple reflection open to everyone. The final sentence, it is probable, which pronounces characters and actions admirable or odious, praiseworthy or blamable, that which stamps on them the mark of honor or infamy, approbation or censure, that which renders morality as active principle and constitutes virtue or happiness and vice or misery. It is possible, I say, that the final sentence depends on some internal sense or feeling which nature has made universal in the whole species. Inquiry 1. And so, when he considers how to determine what qualities to include in the catalogue of the virtues, he remarks, the quick sensibility which, on this head, is so universal among mankind, gives a philosopher sufficient assurance that he can never be mistaken in forming the catalogue or incur any danger of misplacing the object of his contemplation. That is, he needs only enter into his own heart for a moment, and consider whether or not he should desire or have this or that quality ascribed to him. He should desire to have this or that quality ascribed to him. About the virtues, apparently we cannot be mistaken. Yet who are we? For Hume also believes very strongly that some accounts of the virtues are mistaken. Diogenes, Pascal, and others who uphold what he abhors as the monkish virtues, and the levelers of the preceding century, all incur his severe censure. Such examples Hume does not treat in terms of a general thesis to which he is otherwise committed, that apparent variations and differences in morality are to be explained entirely as the same human nature responding to different circumstances. A stubborn realism forces him to acknowledge the occurrence of cases which cannot thus be dealt with. What he cannot acknowledge, of course, is that within the limits imposed by his own understanding of the virtues, these cases can scarcely be dealt with at all. Why this is so emerges when we consider two incompatible attitudes which Hume adopts towards them. For, on the one hand, Hume insists that there is nothing to judgments of virtue and vice except the expression of feelings of approval and disapproval. Thus, there can be no criteria external to those feelings by appeal to which we may pass judgment upon them. Hume does recognize that Diogenes and Pascal had held philosophical theories which lead, or as he thinks mislead, them to believe that there are such criterion. But his own theory has to exclude the possibility of such a criterion. Yet at the same time, he wishes to condemn, sometimes in the harshest terms, those who hold certain alternative views of the virtues. We may perhaps have expected such condemnations to rest on an appeal to Hume's metaphysical views. In expressing his own moral preferences in a letter to Francis Hutchinson, letter B of September 17, 1739, in Greek, 1932, he wrote, "Upon the whole, I desire to take my catalogue of virtues from Cicero's offices, and not from the whole duty of man." His preference for Cicero over the Christian work clearly arises, at least in the main, from the fact that he takes central Christian beliefs to be false in a way, and to a degree that Cicero's were not. And earlier in the same letter, Hume had attacked any teleological view of human nature, thus explicitly dismissing any kind of Aristotelian view. But while the falsity of certain metaphysical views is necessary if Hume's own position on the virtues is to be vindicated, that falsity is not sufficient. And Hume's problem about how ought may be derived from is denies him any overt appeal to his own understanding of the nature of things to supply that insufficiency. Hence, although Hume may find in what he takes to be the falsity of the Christian religion a ground for condemning the adherents of the monkish virtues, Hume condemns humility as useless, for example. His final court of appeal can be no more than the appeal to the passions of men of good sense, to a concurrence of feelings among the worldly. Thus, the appeal to a universal verdict by mankind turns out to be the mask worn by an appeal to those who physiologically and socially share Hume's attitudes and Weltanschauung. The passions of some are to be preferred to the passions of others. Whose preferences reign? The preferences of those who accept the stability of property, of those who understand chastity in women as a virtue only because it is a useful device to secure that property is passed on only to legitimate heirs, of those who believe that the passage of time confers legitimacy upon what was originally acquired by violence and aggression. What Hume identifies as the standpoint of universal human nature turns out in fact to be that of the prejudices of the Hanoverian ruling elite. Hume's moral philosophy presupposes allegiance to a particular kind of social structure as much as Aristotle's does, but allegiance of a highly ideological kind. Hume thus provides, and I am here repeating part of the argument of Chapter 4, an unsatisfactory underpinning for an attempt to claim universal rational authority for what is in fact the local morality of parts of 18th century Northern Europe. It is scarcely surprising that rival attempts to achieve the same end multiply. Some of these, Diderot's for example, and Kant's, I also noticed earlier. Others I shall draw attention to presently. But before doing so, it is important to notice three features of Hume's treatment of the virtues which recur in other 18th century and 19th century moral philosophies. The first of these concerns the characterization of particular virtues. In a society where there is no longer a shared conception of the community's good, as specified by the good for man, there can no longer either be any very substantial concept of what it is to contribute more or less to the achievement of that good. Hence, notions of desert and of honor become detached from the context in which they were originally at home. Honor becomes nothing more than a badge of aristocratic status, and status itself, tied as it is now so securely to property, has very little to do with desert. Distributive justice cannot any longer be defined in terms of desert either, and so the alternatives become those of defining justice in terms of some sort of equality, a project which Hume himself rejects, or in terms of legal entitlements. And justice is not the only virtue that has to be redefined. Any conception of chastity as a virtue, in anything like the traditional meaning of the word, in a world uninformed by either Aristotelian or biblical values, will make very little sense to the adherents of the dominant culture, and Hume's connection of female chastity with property is only the first of a series of desperate attempts to find some place for it. Other virtues fare a little better, although, since utility becomes the hallmark of a virtue not only for Hume, but also, for example, for Franklin, the vagueness and generality of the notion of utility infects any conception of doing good, and more particularly the new conception of the virtue of benevolence. Benevolence, in the 18th century, is assigned very much the scope which the Christian scheme of the virtues assigned to charity. But unlike charity, benevolence as a virtue became a license for almost any kind of manipulative intervention in the affairs of others. A second feature of Hume's treatment of the virtues which recurs in later thought and practice is a new conception of the relationship of virtues to rules. I remarked earlier upon the degree to which the concept of a rule acquired a new centrality in modern individualist morality. Virtues are indeed now conceived of not as in the Aristotelian scheme, as possessing a role and function distinct and to be contrasted with that of rules or laws, but rather as being just those dispositions necessary to produce obedience to the rules of morality. The virtues of justice, as Hume characterized it, is nothing but a disposition to obey the rules of justice. Hume will have many successors in this, among them both Kant and Mill, and a contemporary writer who is the heir of this modern tradition actually defines the notion of a virtue in terms of the notion of a moral principle. Quote, "The virtues are sentiments, that is, related families of dispositions and propensities regulated by a higher order desire, in this case, a desire to act from the corresponding moral principles." Rawls, 1971, page 192. It is no accident that the same writer divorces our commitment to both principles and virtues from any substantial belief in the good for man. On this, see further chapter 17. A third feature of Hume's treatment of the virtues, which becomes even more salient later, is the shift from a conception of the virtues as plural to one of virtues as primarily singular. As a linguistic phenomenon, this is a part of a general process whereby the moral vocabulary gradually came to be simplified and homogenized. Within the Aristotelian scheme, the term moral virtue was not a tautological expression, but by the end of the 18th century, the term moral and the term virtuous have come to be used as synonyms. Later still, duty and obligation came to be treated as largely interchangeable, and so did dutiful and virtuous. Where once the common language of morality, even in everyday speech, had embodied a set of precise distinctions which presupposed a complex moral scheme, there come into being a kind of linguistic melange which enables very little to be said. Within this trend, there do, of course, emerge new linguistic distinctions of a more specialized kind. Immoral and vice become associated in the 19th century with whatever threatens the sanctity of the Victorian marriage, that last refuge of those who, outside the domestic sphere, were quite prepared to be scoundrels and hence acquired in some circles an exclusively sexual connotation. The Society for the Suppression of Vice did not have amongst its interests the suppression of either injustice or cowardice. What these linguistic twists and turns testify to is the way in which the moral vocabulary had become detached from any precise central context of understanding and made available to different competing moral groups for their special and differing purposes. But this fate was still in the future when the term virtue became primarily a single noun. For initially, then this linguistic change was associated with one very precise moral direction. I remarked in chapter 13 that when teleology, whether Aristotelian or Christian, is abandoned, there is always a tendency to substitute for it some version of Stoicism. The virtues are now not to be practiced for the sake of some good other or more than the practice of the virtues itself. Virtue is, indeed, has to be its own end, its own reward, and its own motive. It is central to this Stoic tendency to believe that there is a single standard of virtue and that moral achievement lies simply in total complacence with it. As recurrently in the ancient world as in the 12th century, so it is also with the 18th century Stoicism in all its versions. And this is not surprising, since the background to Stoic ethics in the 18th century was a doctrine of nature similar to and indebted to the metaphysics of ancient Stoicism. Nature for many writers becomes what God had been for Christianity. Nature is conceived of as an actively benevolent agent. Nature is the legislator for our good. Diderot, who often thinks of nature in this way, is thereby forced to pose the problem of how nature, being so benevolent and powerful, can permit the occurrence of evils, in a way that precisely parallels the problem raised for Christian theologians by the occurrence of evils in a universe cared and ruled by an omnipotent and benevolent deity. And in so doing, Diderot reveals more plainly than do others the way in which nature itself has become a new deity. Nature harmonizes, nature orders, nature provides us with a rule of life. Thus even some Christians are apt to see what is crucial to their ethics as being the maxim to understand and to live in accordance with their nature. From this arises a peculiar blend of Stoicism and Christianity, more strikingly exemplified by Dr. Johnson. In Johnson's writings, the influence of Juvenal and Epictetus is modified by Johnson's judgment that the Stoics took too high a view of human nature. Yet in the sixth Rambler, he nonetheless concludes that he who has so little knowledge of human nature as to seek happiness by changing everything but his own disposition will waste his life in further efforts and multiply the griefs which he proposes to remove. The cultivation of the virtues cannot issue in any further happiness. Consequently, when Johnson praises patience, the distance between his conception of patience and that of the medieval tradition is as great as the distance between Hume's concept of justice and Aristotle's. For the medievals, the virtue of patience, as I pointed out earlier, is intimately related to the virtue of hope. To be patient is to be prepared to wait until the promise of life is fulfilled. For Johnson, at least so far as this life is concerned, to be patient is to be prepared to live without hope. Hope is necessarily deferred to another world. Once again, the conception of a particular virtue is transformed in a way that corresponds to a change in the general understanding of the virtues. A far more optimistic version of Stoicism is to be found in the writings of Adam Smith, a deist rather than a Christian, and Smith is explicit about his central debt to Stoic moral philosophy. For Smith, the virtues fall into two classes. There are, on the one hand, those three virtues which, if they are perfectly possessed, enable a man to exhibit perfectly virtuous behavior. The man who acts according to the rules of perfect prudence, of strict justice, and of proper benevolence may be said to be perfectly virtuous. Smith, Theory of Moral Sentiments, 6.3.1. Notice, of course, that once again, to be virtuous had been equated with rule following. When Smith comes to deal with justice, he makes it a charge against ancient moralists that we do not find any attempt towards a particular enumeration of the rules of justice. But on Smith's view of knowledge of what the rules are, whether the rules of justice or of prudence or of benevolence, it is not sufficient to enable us to follow them. To do so, we need another virtue of a very different kind, the Stoic virtue of self-command, which enables us to control our passions when they distract us from what virtue requires. Smith's catalogue of the virtues is then not the same as Hume's. We have already reached a point at which rival and incompatible tables of the virtues have become more common. Nor is this degree and kind of variation restricted to moral philosophy. One source, in England at least, of knowledge about common beliefs about the virtues in the 17th and 18th centuries is the Church of England tombstone or memorial in church or graveyard. Neither Protestant dissenters nor Roman Catholics generally carried on this practice of funerary inscription in a systematic way in this period, so what we learn from tombstones concerns only one section of the population, and one, moreover, ostensibly still committed by its religious allegiance to a Christian theology. But this makes the degree of variation in funerary catalogues of the virtues all the more impressive. There are, for example, Humean inscriptions. The memorial to Captain Cook, erected by Sir Hugh Pulsner in 1780 on his own land, speaks of Cook as possessing every useful and amiable quality. There are inscriptions in which moral has already acquired a highly restricted meaning, so that to praise someone's virtues you must praise more than his or her morality. Correct in morals, elegant in manners, steady in friendship, diffusive in benevolence, says the tablet commemorating Sir Francis Lumb in St. James's, Piccadilly, in 1797, in a way that suggests that the Aristotelian idea of the great-souled man still lives. And there are distinctively Christian inscriptions: love, peace, goodness, faith, hope, charity, humility, sincerity, gentleness are the virtues ascribed to Margaret Yates in the same church in 1817. We should take note that sincerity is a relative newcomer to this list of the virtues, for reasons which Lionel Trilling analyzed brilliantly in Sincerity and Authenticity, and that the memorial to Cook follows Hume, and of course Aristotle, in praising the intellectual virtue of practical judgment, as well as the virtues of character, while Margaret Yates's inscription perhaps suggests that "be good, sweet maid, and let who will be clever" is one of the underlying maxims. What is abundantly clear is that in everyday life, as in moral philosophy, the replacement of Aristotelian or Christian teleology by a definition of the virtues in terms of the passions is not so much or at all the replacement of one set of criteria by another, but rather a movement towards and into a situation where there are no longer any clear criteria. It is unsurprising that the adherents of virtue begin to look for another basis for moral belief, and that various forms of moral rationalism and intuitionism reappear, articulated by philosophers such as Kant, who saw himself as the preeminent modern heir of the Stoics, and Richard Price, philosophers in whom the movement towards a morality exclusively of rules also continues to be clearly marked. Adam Smith did in fact allow for one moral area in which rules will not supply us with what we need. There are always borderline cases in which we do not know how to apply the relevant rule, and which niceness of feeling must therefore guide us. Smith attacks the whole notion of casuistry as a wrong-headed attempt to provide for the application of rules even in such cases. In Kant's moral writings, by contrast, we have reached a point at which the notion that morality is anything other than obedience to rules has almost, if not quite, disappeared from sight. And so the central problems of moral philosophy come to cluster around the question: how do we know which rules to follow? Virtue concepts become as marginal to the moral philosopher as they are to the morality of the society which he inhabits. There is, however, another source for that marginality. Those various 18th century writers upon the virtues, who defined the virtues in terms of their relationship to the passions, already treat of society as nothing more than an arena in which individuals seek to secure what is useful or agreeable to them. Thus they tend to exclude from view any conception of society as a community united in a shared vision of the good for man, as prior to and independent of any summing of individual interests, and a consequent shared practice of the virtues, but they do not always and entirely so exclude it. Stoicism characteristically has a political dimension, and Adam Smith, for example, was a lifelong Republican. And the connection between Smith's preoccupation with virtue and his republicanism was not something peculiar to his own thought. Republicanism in the 18th century is the project of restoring a community of virtue, but it envisages that project in an idiom inherited from Roman rather than Greek sources and transmitted through the Italian republics of the Middle Ages. Machiavelli, with his exaltation of civic virtue over both the Christian and the pagan virtues, articulates one aspect of the republican tradition, but only one. What is central to that tradition is the notion of a public good, which is prior to and characterizable independently of the summing of individual desires and interests. Virtue in the individual is nothing more or less than allowing the public good to provide the standard for individual behavior. The virtues are those dispositions which uphold that overriding allegiance. Hence, republicanism, like Stoicism, makes virtue primary and the virtues secondary. The connection between 18th century republicanism and 18th century Stoicism is a loose one. Many Stoics were not Republican. Dr. Johnson was devoutly loyal to the Hanoverians, and many Republicans were not Stoics. but they share an idiom. They use the resources of the same moral vocabulary, and it is unsurprising when we come across someone like Adam Smith who shares both allegiances. Republicanism therefore represents an attempt at a partial restoration of what I have called the classical tradition, but it enters the modern world without either of the two great negative features which had so much to do with the discrediting of the classical tradition during the Renaissance and in the early modern period. It did not, as I have just noticed, speak in an Aristotelian idiom, and thus did not carry the burden of an apparent allegiance with a defeated version of natural science. And it was not disfigured by the patronage of those absolute despotisms, both in the state and in the church, which at the very same time as they destroyed the medieval inheritance attempted to clothe themselves in the language of tradition, inventing such doctrines as that 16th and 17th century perversion, the doctrine of the absolute divine right of kings. Republicanism, by contrast, inherited from the institutions of the medieval and Renaissance republic what amounted to a passion for equality. The corporate ethos, Jean Buckler has written, was fundamentally egalitarian. Members of the guild, political society, parte, or militia company, gonfalone, were assumed to possess equal rights and privileges and to bear equal obligations to the society of their fellows. Equality of respect provided the ground for service for the corporate community. This is why the Republican conception of justice was defined basically in terms of equality, but secondarily in terms of public merit, a notion for which once again a place has to be found. The Aristotelian virtue of friendship and the Christian love of the neighbor both contributed in the 18th century to the newly named virtue of fraternity, and the Republican concept of liberty was Christian too. Qui servare est regnar, says the prayer about God, or, as the English version has it, whom to serve is perfect freedom. And when the Christians said about God, the Republicans, and what the Christian said about God, the Republican says of the Republic. There's a series of later writers, J.L. Tauman, Isaiah Berlin, and Daniel Bell are examples, who see this Republican commitment to a public virtue the genesis of totalitarianism and even of terror. Any short reply to their thesis will necessarily appear inadequate, but I am inclined to retort that I wish that any commitment to virtue were so powerful as to be able to produce of itself such stupendous effects. It was rather, so I would claim, the ways in which the commitment to virtue was institutionalized politically, I shall say a little more about this presently, and not the commitment itself, which produced some, at least, of the consequences which they abhor. But in fact, most modern totalitarianism and terror has nothing to do with any commitment to virtue. I thus take 18th century republicanism to be a more serious claimant for moral allegiance than such writers suggest. And it is well worth exploring its catalogue of the virtues a little further, as exemplified in, for example, the Jacobean clubs. Liberty, fraternity, and equality were not the only Jacobean virtues. Patriotism and love of family were both important. The persistent bachelor was regarded as an enemy of virtue. So was the man who failed to do useful, productive work, or who failed to do good work. It was regarded as a virtue to dress simply, to live in a modest dwelling, to be, of course, regular in attending one's club and performing other civic duties, to be courageous and assiduous in the work given one to do by the Revolution. The badges of virtue were long hair, visits to a barber were a form of vice, and so was overmuch attention to one's appearance, and the absence of a beard. Beards were associated with the Ancien regime. It is not difficult to see this as a remaking by societies of democratically inspired craftsmen and tradesmen of the classical ideal. In the Jacobean clubs, something of Aristotle, as well as a great deal more of Rousseau, lived, but with only the most limited cultural power. Why so? The true lesson of the Jacobean clubs and their downfall is that you cannot hope to reinvent morality on the scale of a whole nation, when the very idiom of the morality which you seek to reinvent is alien in one way to the vast mass of ordinary people, and in another to the intellectual elite. The attempt to oppose morality by terror, the solution of St. Just, is the desperate expedient of those who already glimpse this fact but will not admit it. It is this and not the ideal of public virtue which, so I would agree, breeds totalitarianism. To understand this is to be given the essential clue to the predicament of all those adherents of the older tradition of the virtues, some of whom cannot even recognize any more than that is why they are, who seek to reestablish the virtues. Consider briefly just two of them, William Cobbett and Jane Austen. Cobbett, the last man of the old England and the first man of the new, said Marx, crusaded to change the society as a whole. Jane Austen tried to discover enclaves for the life of the virtues within it. Cobbett looked backward to the England of his childhood, beyond that to England before the oligarchical settlement of 1688, and yet further to England before the Reformation, seeing each stage as one in decline towards his own day. Like Jefferson, Cobbett believed that the small working farmer is the social type of the virtuous man. If the cultivators of the land be not, generally speaking, the most virtuous and the most happy of mankind, there must be something at work in the community to counteract the operations of nature. Political Register 39, 5th of May, 1821. Nature constrains the farmer so that he has to be practically wise. The nature and quality of all living things are known to country boys better than to philosophers. When Cobbett speaks of philosophers, it is usually Malthus and the Adam Smith of the Wealth of Nations, as that book had come to be read in the light of Ricardo's doctrine, to whom he is referring. Virtues which Cobbett particularly praises are the lack of envy, love of liberty, perseverance in industry, patriotism, integrity, and justice. The something at work in the community, which counteracts the tendency to produce a virtuous and happy community, is the all-pervasive influence of pleonexia, although that is not Cobbett's word, in the form of the usury, that is Cobbett's word, inflicted on society by an individualistic economy and market in which land, labor, and money itself have all been transformed into commodities. It is precisely because Cobbett looks back across the great division in human history towards the past, before individualism and the power of markets, before what Karl Polanyi called the Great Transformation, that Marx saw Cobbett as possessing his peculiar significance for English history. Jane Austen, by contrast, identifies that social sphere within which the practice of the virtues is able to continue. It is not, of course, that she is blind to the economic realities against which Cobbett railed. We learn somewhere in all her novels about where the money of the main characters comes from. We see a great deal of the economic self-seeking of the pleonexia which is central to Cobbett's vision. So much so, indeed, that David Diakes once described her as a Marxist before Marx. Her heroines must, if they are to survive, seek for economic security. But this is not just because of the threat of the outside economic world. It is also because the telos of her heroines is a life within both a particular kind of marriage and a particular kind of household, of which that marriage will be the focal point. Her novels are a moral criticism of parents and of guardians quite as much as of young romantics. For the worst parent and guardians, the silly Mrs. Bennet and the irresponsible Mr. Bennet, for example, are what the romantic young may become if they do not learn what they ought to learn on the way to being married. But why is marriage so important? It is finally in the 18th century, when production has moved outside the household, that women no longer for the most part do work not very different in kind or work relationship from that of men, but are instead divided into two classes, a small group of leisured women with no work to fill the day and for whom occupations have to be invented, fine needlework, the reading of bad novels, and organized opportunities for gossip, which are then thought of by both men and women as essentially feminine, and a huge group of women condemned to the drudgery of domestic service, or to that of the mill or factory, or to prostitution. When production was within the household, the unmarried sister or aunt was a useful and valued member of the household. The spinster, not surprisingly, did the spinning. It is only at the beginning of the 18th century that the expression becomes degeneratory. The expression becomes denigratory. And it is only then that the woman who does not marry has to fear expulsion into drudgery as her characteristic lot. Hence, to refuse even a bad marriage is an act of great courage, an act that is central to the plot of Mansfield Park. A major emotion underlying Jane Austen's novels is what D.W. Harding called her regulated hatred of the attitude of society to unmarried women. Her daughter enjoyed a most uncommon degree of popularity for a woman neither young, handsome, rich, nor married. Miss Bates stood in the very worst predicament in the world for having much of the public favor, and she had no intellectual superiority to make atonement to herself or frighten those who might hate her in outward respect. Her youth had passed without distinction, and her middle life was devoted to the care of a failing mother and the endeavor to make a small income go as far as possible. And yet she was a happy woman, and a woman whom no one named without goodwill. It was her own unusual goodwill and contentment which worked such wonders. Miss Bates, you will note, is exceptionally favored because she is exceptionally good. Ordinarily, if you are not rich or beautiful or young or married, you will only gain outward respect generally by using your intellectual superiority to frighten those who will otherwise scorn you, as we may guess did Jane Austen. When Jane Austen speaks of happiness, she does so as an Aristotelian. Gilbert Ryle believed that her Aristotelianism, which he saw as the clue to the moral temper of her novels, may have derived from a reading of Shaftesbury. C.S. Lewis, with equal justice, saw in her an essentially Christian writer. It is her uniting of Christian and Aristotelian themes in a determinate social context that makes Jane Austen the last great effective imaginative voice of the tradition of thought about and practice of the virtues which I have tried to identify. She thus turns away from the competing catalogue of the virtues of the 18th century and restores a teleological perspective. Her heroines seek the good through seeking their own good in marriage. The restricted households of Highbury and Mansfield Park have to serve as surrogates for the Greek city-state and the medieval kingdom. Much, therefore, of what she presents about the virtues and vices is thoroughly traditional. She praises the virtue of being socially agreeable, as Aristotle does, although she values more highly, in her letters as well as in her novels, the virtue of amiability, which requires a genuine loving regard for other people as such, and not only the impression of such regard as embodied in manners. She is, after all, a Christian, and therefore deeply suspicious of an agreeableness that conceals a lack of true amiability. She praises practical intelligence in an Aristotelian way and humility in a Christian way. But she does not ever merely reproduce the tradition. She consciously extends it, and in extending it, she has three central preoccupations. The first I have already noticed. She is, indeed, given the moral climate of her times, she has to be preoccupied in quite a new way with counterfeits of the virtues. Morality in Jane Austen is never the mere inhibition and regulation of the passions, although that is how it may appear to those such as Marianne Dashwood, who have romantically identified themselves with a ruling passion, and who make in a very unhuman way reason the servant of the passions. Morality is rather meant to educate the passions, but the outward appearance of morality may always disguise uneducated passions. And the waywardness of Marianne Dashwood is the waywardness of a victim, whereas the surface propriety of Henry and Mary Crawford, together with their elegance and charm, which do provide a disguise for morally uneducated passions, is apt to victimize others as well as themselves. Henry Crawford is the dissimulator par excellence. He boasts of his ability to act parts, and in one conversation makes it clear that he takes being a clergyman to consist in giving the appearance of being a clergyman. Self is almost, if not quite, dissolved into the presentation of self. But what in Goffman's social world becomes the form of the self is still in Jane Austen's world a symptom of the vices. The counterpart to Jane Austen's preoccupation with the counterfeit is the central place she assigns to self-knowledge. a Christian rather than a Socratic self-knowledge, which can only be achieved through a kind of repentance. In 4 of her 6 great novels, there is a recognition scene in which the person whom the hero or heroine recognizes is himself or herself. "Till this moment, I never knew myself," says Elizabeth Bennet. How to understand the deceptions she had been thus practicing on herself and living under, meditates Emma. Self-knowledge is for Jane Austen both an intellectual and a moral virtue, and it is closely aligned to another virtue which Jane Austen makes central and which is relatively new to the catalogue of the virtues. When Kierkegaard contrasted the ethical and the aesthetic ways of life in Entenella, he argued that the aesthetic life is one in which a human life is dissolved into a series of separate present moments, in which the unity of a human life disappears from view. By contrast, in the ethical life, the commitments and responsibilities to the future springing from past episodes in which obligations were conceived and debts assigned unite the past and the future in such a way as to make a human life a unity. The unity to which Kierkegaard refers is the narrative unity whose central place in the life of the virtues I identified in the preceding chapter. By the time Jane Austen writes, that unity can no longer be treated as a mere presupposition or context for a virtuous life. It has itself to be continually reaffirmed, and its reaffirmation in deed rather than in word is the virtue which Jane Austen calls constancy. Constancy is crucial in at least 2 novels, Mansfield Park and Persuasion, in each of which it is a central virtue of the heroine. Constancy, so Jane Austen makes Anne Elliot argue cogently in the latter novel, is a virtue which women are more apt to practice than are men. And without constancy, all the other virtues to some degree lose their point. Constancy is reinforced by and reinforces the Christian virtue of patience, but it is not the same as patience, just as patience, which is reinforced by and reinforces the Aristotelian virtue of courage, is not the same as courage. For just as patience necessarily involves a recognition of the character of the world of a kind which courage does not necessarily require, so constancy requires a recognition of a particular kind of threat to the integrity of the personality in the peculiarly modern social world, a recognition which patience does not necessarily require. It is no accident that the 2 heroines who exhibit constancy most strikingly are less charming than Jane Austen's other heroines, and that one of them, Fanny Price, has been found positively unattractive by many critics. But Fanny's lack of charm is crucial to Jane Austen's intentions, for charm is the characteristically modern quality which those who lack or simulate the virtues use to get by in the situations of characteristically modern social life. Camus once defined charm as that quality which produces the answer yes before any question has been asked. And the charm of an Elizabeth Bennet, or even of an Emma, may mislead us, genuinely attractive though it is, in our judgment of on their character. Fanny is charmless. She has only the virtues, the genuine virtues, to protect her, and when she disobeys her guardian, Sir Thomas Bertham, and refuses marriage to Henry Crawford, it can only be because of what constancy requires. In so refusing, she places the danger of losing her soul before the reward of gaining what for her would be a whole world. She pursues virtue for the sake of a certain kind of happiness and not for its utility. Jane Austen, through Fanny Price, rejects those alternative catalogues of the virtues that we find in David Hume or Benjamin Franklin. Jane Austen's moral point of view and the narrative form of her novels coincide. The form of her novels is that of ironic comedy. Jane Austen writes comedy rather than tragedy for the same reason that Dante did. She is a Christian, and she sees the telos of human life implicit in its everyday form. Her irony resides in the way she makes her characters and her readers see and say more and other than they intended to, so that they and we correct ourselves. The virtues and the harms and evils which the virtues alone will overcome provide the structure both of a life in which the telos can be achieved and of a narrative in which the story of such a life can be unfolded. Once again, it turns out that any specific amount of the virtues presupposes an equally specific account of the narrative structure and unity of a human life, and vice versa. Jane Austen is, in a crucial way, along with Courbet and the Jacobins, the last great representative of the classical tradition of the virtues. It has provided easy for later generations not to understand her importance as a moralist, because she is after all a novelist, and to them she has often appeared not merely only as a writer of fiction, but a writer of fiction concerned with a very restricted social world. What they have not observed, and what the juxtaposition of her insights with those of Courbet and the Jacobins ought to teach us to observe, is that both in her own time and afterwards, the life of the virtues is necessarily afforded a very restricted cultural and social space. In most of the public and most of the private world, the classical and medieval virtues are replaced by the meager substitutes which modern morality affords. Of course, when I say that Jane Austen is, in a crucial way, the last representative of the classical tradition, I do not mean to deny that she has any descendants. Kipling, in a short story now seldom read, with a good deal of insight, made one of his characters say that she was the mother. He might better have said the grandmother of Henry James. But James writes of a world in which the progress of his own novels testifies to it. The substance of morality is increasingly elusive. That elusiveness alters the character of both private and public life. What it amounts to in public life particularly depends on the fate of the conception of one particular virtue, that of justice. To the question of what happened to our conception of justice, I therefore now turn.